Some people at work do not survive because they are better. They survive because they are harder to move. You can be the one carrying the project, the one fixing the errors, the one remembering every detail, the one staying late without being asked, the one who still believes that competence, decency, and consistency will eventually be recognized. And while you are doing that, someone else is quietly learning how the room actually works. Not how it is described in meetings, not how it looks on paper, how it works. That is the part that burns people out. Not only the workload, not only the pressure. It is the slow, humiliating discovery that effort is not the same thing as leverage. That being responsible is not the same thing as being protected. That being ethical is not the same thing as being safe. You begin to notice a pattern that is hard to say out loud because it sounds irrational when you first hear it. The person who creates tension is often the person who gets the most attention. The person who distorts facts is often the person who controls the narrative. The person who makes things emotionally expensive is often the person others are most careful around. And the person who keeps the entire structure functioning may become the most invisible person in the building. That is not a moral failure. It is a system. And the system is rarely designed to reward the best behavior. It is designed to reduce immediate friction. That is a very different thing. A toxic employee survives not because everyone admires them, but because everyone is tired. Because conflict is costly. Because managers are often not judging character, they are managing disruption. Because many organizations do not protect truth, they protect momentum. And when a person becomes too difficult to confront, the room quietly begins to reorganize itself around them. That is the first hard fact. Power in many workplaces does not go to the most honest person. It goes to the person who makes other people choose the path of least resistance. A toxic employee understands this instinctively. They do not need to be the most skilled. They need to be the most expensive to challenge. They create a small storm, and then they stand at the center of it like they are essential. They complain first, so they look like the injured party. They speak with enough confidence to make uncertainty seem like authority. They say just enough of the right words to appear reasonable to someone who is not paying close attention. They can be charming in front of leadership, difficult in private, and strategically forgetful whenever accountability begins to form. People often think the problem is bad behavior. The deeper problem is that bad behavior is often functional. It buys time. It shifts responsibility. It creates confusion. It turns every issue into a negotiation. It forces other people to spend energy managing the person instead of managing the work. And in many environments, the ability to create that kind of drag becomes a form of insurance. Here is what most stable, ethical employees do not understand at first. They assume that the workplace is a merit system with some flaws. It is often not. It is a tension system, a visibility system, a system of informal alliances, emotional tolls, and hidden trade-offs. If you are calm, reliable, and direct, you may think that your consistency should make you harder to replace and easier to trust. But in a dysfunctional structure, consistency can make you easier to use. You do not demand much. You do not create scenes. You absorb the load. You make the machine look healthier than it is. That is why good people are often overselected for damage. They are the ones who say yes one more time. They are the ones who explain one more time. They are the ones who smooth over what should have been addressed. They are the ones who keep compensating for other people's instability because they still believe the system will eventually notice. But systems rarely reward silent compensation. They adapt to it. They build around it. They begin to treat your endurance as a resource that can be extracted indefinitely. And once that happens, your stability becomes invisible background infrastructure. No one applauds the pipes until they burst out. The toxic employee, by contrast, never allows themselves to become background. They remain a visible problem. They make their presence felt. They create enough uncertainty that people continue to factor them into decisions. That is the hidden genius of chaos. It keeps you relevant without making you admirable. The second layer is even uglier. Toxic people often survive because they understand one simple truth. Many organizations fear emotional discomfort more than they fear long-term damage. A manager may know that someone is manipulative, inconsistent, or corrosive, but if confronting that person means awkward meetings, possible conflict, legal exposure, or the loss of short-term output, the instinct is often delay. Reframe. Minimize. Hope it settles down. It rarely settles down. What grows in that silence is not peace, it is entitlement. The toxic employee learns that the boundaries are soft. They learn that consequences arrive late, if at all. They learn that every act of conflict management is an opportunity to reset the terms. They're not just surviving the system. They are studying its hesitation. Meanwhile, the ethical employee is usually doing the opposite. They are trying to be understandable, predictable, fair. They believe that if they remain rational long enough, the facts will carry the day. But facts do not always carry the day in a workplace. Not when reputation is already shaped. Not when the loudest person has already occupied the narrative space. Not when everyone is too busy to investigate what is actually happening. This is how a person can be technically right and structurally weak at the same time. That is the part people do not want to accept. They want justice to behave like math. It does not. It behaves like pressure. The person who controls the pressure controls the room. And toxicity is often a pressure strategy. It raises the emotional cost of every interaction. It makes people second-guess themselves. It encourages private doubt and public silence. It turns normal requests into risky encounters. If you are the kind of employee who values clarity, this environment is especially punishing because you keep expecting the structure to resolve into truth. Instead, it resolves into avoidance. Then something more damaging begins to happen. You start to adapt to the dysfunction in order to survive it. You become more careful, more guarded, more exhausted. You anticipate moods. You overdocument. You rehearse harmless sentences. You read between lines that should never have been ambiguous in the first place. You spend your mental energy not on the work itself, but on the weather around the work. That is how burnout is manufactured. Not only through volume. Through vigilance, a person can survive a heavy workload if the conditions are stable. But when the environment is unstable, every task carries a second cost. Every email has a subtext. Every meeting has a hidden temperature. Every request may be a trap, a test, or a transfer of blame. The nervous system does not remain neutral in that climate. It starts living in advance of each possible conflict. That is why burnout in these environments feels so personal. It is not just fatigue. It is erosion. You stop trusting your own timing. You stop trusting your own judgment. You begin to feel that the more careful you are, the more exposed you become. And that is a devastating lesson because it rewrites identity. It teaches you that being solid does not necessarily keep you safe. It may simply make you available. The toxic employee often senses this long before you do. They know that decent people hesitate to become ruthless. They know that ethical people often overestimate the moral patience of institutions. They know that many managers prefer a contained liar to an uncontrollable truth teller. So they behave accordingly. They do not need to be trusted by everyone. They only need to be tolerated by the right person at the right time. That is the third mechanism, survival through strategic inconvenience. A toxic person survives because removing them is harder than enduring them. That is the calculus, not justice, not merit, cost. And once you see that, you begin to understand why being stable can become a disadvantage in the wrong environment. Stability is expensive to a system only when the system values integrity. In a dysfunctional system, stability is cheap to exploit. You do not complain much, so your limits are treated as flexible. You do not weaponize confusion, so your clarity is treated as available for free. You do not force emergency meetings with your moods, so no one prioritizes your depletion until something breaks visibly enough to interrupt the schedule. By then, the damage is already distributed through your body, your attention, and your self-concept. This is the quiet violence of workplace toxicity. It does not always arrive as open cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as repeated misalignment. The person who lies a little. The person who blames sideways. The person who keeps just enough ambiguity around them to avoid being pinned down. The person who makes other people look reactive. The person who turns your straight line into a maze. And after enough time, you begin to notice that the most exhausted people are not always the weakest people. They are often the ones who stayed principled inside an unprincipled structure for too long. That is not noble. That is costly. At some point, the crucial question changes. It is no longer, how do I prove I am right? It becomes, what kind of system requires me to keep proving the obvious in order to deserve basic respect? That question matters because it reveals the real terrain. The issue is not one bad person in one bad week. It is a pattern of incentives that rewards disruption, protects ambiguity, and penalizes quiet competence unless that competence also knows how to defend itself politically. And this is where many decent employees get trapped. They think the answer is to work harder, document more, and stay even more composed. Sometimes documentation matters. Sometimes boundaries matter. But the deeper shift is not tactical. It is perceptual. You have to stop confusing being useful with being secure. You have to stop assuming that fairness is already built into the room. You have to stop donating your nervous system to a structure that only notices pain when it becomes inconvenient. That is the practical turning point, not becoming cynical, becoming precise. See the difference between a real problem and a performative one. See who creates confusion and who resolves it. See who benefits when standards become vague. See who survives by being impossible to ignore. See where your own effort is being converted into someone else's insulation. Once you see that conversion process, you stop idealizing the sacrifice. You stop treating burnout as proof of dedication. You start recognizing it as evidence of a broken exchange. And from there, the interchange is simple to say and hard to live. You stop trying to be the moral oxygen of a room that is willing to let you suffocate. That does not mean becoming cold. It means becoming less available for distortion, less willing to explain what was already clear, less likely to merge your value with your output, less eager to rescue people from the consequences of their own behavior, less invested in being liked by people who only benefit from your self-erasure. Because once you understand the structure, you see that toxic employees are not winning because they are better human beings. They are winning in small pockets of structure that have been trained to reward friction management over truth. And you are burning out because you have been trying to survive inside that structure as if it were morally neutral. It is not neutral. It has gravity. It has blind spots. It has protected zones. It has people who can absorb damage and people who can generate it. And if you do not learn which side of that equation you are on, you will keep mistaking endurance for safety. The final truth is not comforting, but it is freeing. The system may not change because you became reasonable. The toxic person may not become fair because you stayed composed. The room may not suddenly grow a conscience. But you can stop participating in your own invisibility. You can stop confusing your silence with strength. You can stop handing over your clarity to people who only value it when it is useful to them. That is how you begin to recover agency. Not by hoping the structure becomes kind, by seeing it clearly enough that it no longer owns your interpretation of it. And once that happens, the spell weakens. The workload may still be there. The personalities may still be there. The politics may still be there. But you are no longer inside the story as a trapped participant. You are looking at the machine. And when you can see the machine, you are no longer only the one it feeds on.